Welcome to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, a weekly news hour highlighting the intersections overlapping the world of sports, activism, and radical politics. We are available for broadcast by Pacificum Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations. If you can't listen live, we are also available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and the Google Play Store. Audio streams of this podcast and video editions are also available through our site, nasradicalsports.com. To contact the show, it's at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter or Instagram. Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, nasradicalsports.com, and the hashtag NASRadio to reach us. We want to start out this last show of 2017 by talking about the fact that we were on the disabled list for much of the month of December. Illness really started racking things up for most of December, so a lot of missed shows there. We do apologize for that, but we are back in the saddle and we are back here to start talking about what we missed during those weeks and to close out the year of 2017. With some big props to Rashard Matthews, the Titans wide receiver, wore cleats to honor Colin Kaepernick and his Know Your Rights camps. So really cool to see the efforts of Colin Kaepernick being used there. That was some real positive things happening there. We also want to give out a shout out to Rising Hearts, the activists who worked on the Yes Men style campaign where they claimed that the Washington, D.C. franchise got rid of their racist name and came up with a number of websites and mock-ups of things that really looked like the Washington Post. They really looked like the New York Times. They really looked like Sports Illustrated. And use those to start making the claim that the Washington, D.C. franchise did indeed get rid of their racist name, which then forced the Washington, D.C. team to come out and say, no, actually, they were keeping the racist slur of a name for their franchise. And really, again, sparking the discussion about why a team is named a dictionary-defined racial slur as we close out 2017. So very awesome work in the style of the Yes Men activists coming out and making a statement about something involving corporate responsibility and forcing the corporation to then come out and say, no, actually, we're not really being responsible about it. No, we're actually not doing that and taking that stand, and getting people talking about why they're not taking that stand. And props to Stacia Robitaille, the wife of the former hockey great Luc Robitaille, had tweeted out earlier during the Me Too campaign saying, quote, I was once on an elevator alone with Donald Trump and a man with him at Madison Square Garden. He was aggressive and told me I was coming home with him. I laughed, stated I was then married to a New York Ranger. He guaranteed me my husband didn't make as much money as him. Hashtag this is our president. And we also want to send some jeers to the American Airlines staff for assuming that two D-League players, Marquise Teague and Tresson Burrell, in the NBA. And yes, I understand the rename is now the G-League in honor of Gatorade. But I'm still going to call it the D-League because, well, I hate implicit advertising. It was alleged that they stole first-class blankets and kicked them off a plane, causing them to miss a team dinner. Ultimately, it was found out that two people in first class gave them the blankets, and Teague and Burrell did nothing wrong. So big jeers to American Airlines staff for that, and they've had a whole history of this kind of behavior, and it's why the NAACP even has a travel advisory with American Airlines. Well, we are going to get into a very stacked show. We've got weeks of material to get through and some big news stories to talk about as we close out the year of 2017 here on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports. We're going to get right into it talking NFL news. We saw President Donald Trump again picking fights with people of color for not being what he thinks is grateful and respectful, saying that, quote, at least 24 players kneeling at NFL stadiums that are now having a very hard time filling up. The American public is fed up with the disrespect the NFL is paying to our country, our flag, our national anthem, weak and out of control, close quote. But in actuality, number one, it was 19 players, as a lot of them are moving away from the symbolic protest action. Number two, it's more on-the-ground organizing and supporting and signal boosting of the grassroots that are being done right now by a lot of players, that they're foregoing the act of the symbolic protest in favor of much more on the ground support and on the ground work. And as for teams not being able to sell at stadium space, that's more of a discussion of LA not being able to handle multiple teams, or teams not being particularly good, or teams already being way out of the playoff picture. That's more of the issue. It's not that fans are mad about protests. And to say that fans are mad about protests, and that's the problem, rather than police killing unarmed people and getting away with it, that's a frightening misuse of priorities. Eric Reid and Michael Thomas also announced this week that they have pulled out of the Players Coalition, saying that the Players Coalition was supposed to be formed as a group that represents NFL athletes who have been silently protesting social injustices and racism. However, Malcolm, meaning Malcolm Jenkins, and Anquan Boldin, can no longer speak on our behalf, as we don't believe the coalition's beliefs are in our best interests as a whole. We will continue to have dialogue with the league to find equitable solutions, but without Malcolm and Anquan as our representatives. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell is trying to make this as easy for the owners to agree as possible, so that, again, their goal is to end the protests. He's trying to make look easy as possible for the owners. He's going to present them with a proposal saying, look, you really don't have to do anything. We're just going to shift this money from this area and just move it here. And this statement comes as the NFL and the Players Coalition made an announcement of a 7-year, $89 million proposal that breaks down to about $250,000 per owner. And it ends up being money that was already pledged to charities, just getting shifted around and moved around to this new development. That this was already allocated money. This is not going to be more spending or extra expenditures. This is already earmarked money for these kinds of expenditures to charity that are now going to be used for this, with 25% going to the United Negro College Fund, 25% to the Dream Corps, and 50% to the Players Coalition through the Hopewell Fund. Which makes me wonder, how is this going to stop anybody getting killed by cops? How is any of this going to actually address the real systemic issues that started when the WNBA players decided to take a knee during their games, and then Colin Kaepernick decided to take his knee and starting the protests in the NFL following suit of the WNBA players? How is any of this going to stop people being killed by police? That we can have education, we can have all of these systems set up to give more opportunities to people, but that's not going to stop officers from killing people with impunity. We've seen college graduates be killed. We've seen high school graduates be killed. We've seen honor students get killed. We've seen just regular people walking down the street get killed. And this is why Eric Reid, Michael Thomas, and others are not really happy with this solution. And they allege they were actually asked, if we give you this $89 million over 7 years, will you stop protesting? Will you stop protesting? And the board that's set up on this, we already have the issue that, one, this is not really addressing the issue that the protest was set out to address, which was how people are going to be stopped from getting killed by police officers. There's none of this is addressing that. We also have the issue that there was the expectation of these protests ending if the league gave out the money. There's also the issue that this is not a new expenditure. This is simply money that's still getting used for charity purposes, just being repurposed. This isn't new money. It's not more money. It's not more expenditures from the owners. This is just shifting money that would have gone to a previous charity now going to this. The other issue is that the board that's going to determine how the money gets distributed into which groups it gets distributed is 5 players, 5 owners, and 2 NFL staff. So we're at, and if you can do your math really quickly like I can, 7 NFL staff and 5 players. 7 representatives from the league and 5 players. So the league gets to control where this money goes. The league gets to control where this money goes. And is it any surprise, given this, that Eric Reid left the Players Coalition. Michael Thomas left the coalition, and that Kenny Stills criticized this decision, arguing that it's not really in the best interest of the players. And this is where we get into this fundamental divide of what's going to be the most effective method to have this protest. You have people like Anquan Boldin and Malcolm Jenkins believing that working through the system is the best way to do this, that working through the avenues of power, working through the mainstream ideas of power and the mainstream avenues of power is the way that you're going to get change, that you get change through reform. And we're seeing that here, that they believe that going through this mainstream method, focusing on getting money for these organizations is going to bring real systemic change. And you have the opposite groups like Eric Reed, like Michael Thomas, who believe that that's not necessarily going to be what works. And personally, in my own opinion, I don't think that Boldin and Jenkins' idea is a solid one. I don't think it's a very effective one, because the board is got a majority of NFL league office officials on it, so they get to help dictate where this money goes and which groups it's going to get funded. That this is not new money. This is all just the same amount of money that's just being shifted around and moved around by the league. That what sounds like a very large proposal of $89 million over 7 years is not really all that much money when you realize that the NFL makes over $9 billion a season. That's the issue with this. That's the problem with this. Nowhere in any of this is there anything about fighting against police brutality. Nowhere is there in any of this about fighting against the impunity of police and murdering people. Nowhere in any of this is that happening at all. Now, Malcolm Jenkins did write a letter saying, quote, "It has been my goal for the past 2 years to raise awareness about some important social injustices that plague our country. The people who have been unjustly disenfranchised by our criminal justice system, and the people who fight daily will have for them always have and always will be the inspiration and focus of my efforts. I am proud of what my peers and I have been able to accomplish by using the platform we have these last 2 years. I'm proud to be a part of these group of men. We're standing up because we can help others. I'm proud of the men who may now disagree with me and our direction, but have still played a significant role in getting results through actions. We will not be deterred from fighting for justice. There are many players across the league who have joined these efforts towards new legislation, reestablishing trust with our police, and helping to create educational and economic opportunities in our communities. I welcome anyone who wants to join us. The real work began in the summer of 2016 after many of us saw what transpired around Alton Sterling, Philando Castile, and others. We realized what we needed to get involved was for those men and the many others before them and the many of those who would come after them. A lot of work began to educate ourselves in the inner workings of the criminal justice system. When our protests began that fall, it sparked conversation. We all realized our unique platform to raise awareness and get people talking about the issues. It grew from there. Guys thought they had an opportunity to make a difference, and Anquan Boldin rallied a group of us to go to Capitol Hill in November 2016. It kept growing, with a large group of NFL players and others joining the effort. The stories we have heard and the people we have met these last couple of years keep us going. The children growing up in the cities who don't get the educations they need or deserve, the inherent discrimination we've seen in our criminal justice system that locks up more black bodies in 2017 than were forced into slavery in the pre-Civil War era. The people who believe that lives don't matter when they watch time and again their friends, families, and neighbors being shot in the street. Did you know that you can be arrested and held in jail, sometimes for months, without a conviction? Did you know children are being given life without parole for crimes that didn't fit the punishment? Many of us, Doug Baldwin, Chris Long, Torrey Smith, Anquan Boldin, Rodney McLeod, and others have spent time in cities and towns talking with these people about issues and pushing these legislators to right these wrongs. What we've learned is that this is not a Democrat or Republican issue, it's an American issue and an American problem. That is why we are moving forward with our efforts in the coalition to drive forward initiatives, campaigns, and advocacy efforts to force legislators to make this a priority, close quote. And that's part of this issue, that we can get half loaves through legislation. We can get half loaves through legislation. And to get laws passed, influence legislators is one tactic. But there's also this opposite tactic of the grassroots moves of protest and agitation to challenge institutional power. And we see Jenkins in this advocating for this more institutional approach. And it's an approach that I find somewhat incomplete in being able to handle a problem or being able to handle a situation. a number of years ago when one of our senators, Dick Durbin, was in town. An activist friend of mine, Aaron Ammons, asked him a very real question about the inequalities of the drug war involving cocaine, and that the penalties for having crack cocaine were a lot harsher than having the powdered version of cocaine. And that goes back to the 1980s. It goes back to a lot of race-based nonsense that was used to get this kind of system set up, a lot of class-based nonsense as well, to get that system set up. And Dick Durbin told us that we should be happy that it was no longer the 100 times longer penalty, that it was only, just a few other times, like a few more times, and, that this half loaf of injustice was going to be better. And I keep thinking back to the Malcolm X idea of you don't stick a knife into somebody's back 9 inches, pull it out 6, and then say you're making progress. And that's the fundamental issue here. It's why spending time and spending money on organizations that don't have a thing to do with police brutality, don't have a thing to do with police injustice, are being funded in this instance, and we don't even know what might actually get funded because the league holds the majority of the board that's going to make the decisions about where the money's going to go. We don't necessarily know if this is going to be a positive thing for the players or not. And this shift, this legislative versus grassroots agitation to challenge institutional power, is at the focus of this disagreement. It's at the focus of this problem. And it's one that we have to make the decision, is institutionally and legislatively pushing agendas to try to make half piecemeal fixes going to be the best thing as harm reduction in the short term, or should we be advocating for a more wholesale dismantling and restructuring of an unjust system? Meanwhile, Colin Kaepernick won a few different awards, the Sports Illustrated Muhammad Ali Legacy Award. And Lonnie Ali said, quote, "I'm proud to be able to present this to Colin for his passionate defense of social justice and civil rights for all people. Like Muhammad, Colin is a man who stands on his convictions with confidence and courage, undaunted by the personal sacrifices he's had to make to have his message heard. And he has used his celebrity and philanthropy to the benefit of some of our most vulnerable community members." While the Fox and Friends Paste Eating Hour decided to weigh in and said, quote, "They just turned Muhammad Ali's Legacy Award into toilet paper. Look, Kaepernick is no Ali, and the idea that the left continues to want to sell this lie to America, this man stands for something that supposedly is happening in this country that's not, just shows you that the left will never give up on this narrative," close quote. And that was Kevin Jackson of the Fox and Friends Paste Eating Hour. And yes, Kaepernick is no Ali. Ali was resisting the Vietnam War and militarism in the 1960s and the early 1970s. Kaepernick is resisting the killings of unarmed people by police and the injustice that police can kill people and get away with it with impunity. And it is happening in this country. We've seen an increased rise in it. And I know facts and data are not something that the Fox and Friends Hour and their ilk really like to look at, but reality has a certain bias. Co-host Brian Kilmeade said, quote, "Let's talk about the differences. Muhammad Ali gets told you better get drafted. You are drafted, go. And he says, I'm not. It's against my religious beliefs. I won't do it, so he's out. They strip him of his heavyweight title, which is bizarre in retrospect. And for 3.5 years, he has absolutely no money. Colin Kaepernick has already made $1 zillion where there wasn't that much money in sports back then anyway. And then he walked away from that contract in 2016. He would have still been on the roster. They would have had to cut him or he would have had payout," close quote. Well, yes, Colin Kaepernick and Muhammad Ali, Kaepernick gets more money based on the fact that he is an athlete in today's era, based on the fact that efforts by players like Curt Flood, efforts by players like Oscar Robertson, efforts by players like Curt Flood, this was not just something that was just given to them by sports owners or league owners. This is not something that was just, doled out for the happiness and well-being of these athletes. It was something that was fought for. It was something that was demanded, and it was something where very real efforts happened to make the owners start giving this money. And to say that they strip him of his heavyweight title is bizarre in retrospect. If Fox and Friends was around in the 1960s or in the 1970s, they would have been the ones out there bleating about how Muhammad Ali is unpatriotic. Muhammad Ali hates the troops. Muhammad Ali hates the military. They would have been out there trumpeting that and the racist dog whistles that go along with it. But of course, now that we've kind of Santa Clausified Muhammad Ali and his radical stances, his radical history, you certainly get that. And then they, of course, had to say that, quote, Colin Kaepernick gives money to terrorists, close quote. Which is just laughable because that's not true. He's spent $1 million funding different community grassroots organizations, different organizations doing the work, doing the on-the-ground efforts. And, of course, that's facing pushback from the Fox and Friends Paste-Eating Hour, as well as former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, now on Fox. He tweeted out, quote, new name for old magazine. Sports Illustrated will now become Sports Eliminated. Kaepernick gets Ali Award. Heck, I've played in as many NFL games this year as he has, but then he's done a lot to destroy NFL, so makes sense. What did he do to destroy the NFL? Show that they were colluding to possibly keep him out of the league? Highlight the fact that they only started the anthem and making people go out for the anthem after they were getting money from the Department of Defense and the Pentagon? And yeah, you may have played as many NFL games in this year as he has, but you weren't being actively blackballed or actively boycotted by the league. He was. We also saw precious little snowflake Tomi Lahren get involved, saying, quote, police-hating Beyonce presents police in America-hating Cappy with Legacy Award. This is how far we've fallen. Wow. If I call police officers racist despite the fact numbers prove otherwise, will you get Beyonce to give me a Muhammad Ali Legacy Award? Thanks in advance. It's a sad display of grown-up participation awards. Oh, the snowflake status of these people is really funny when they start yelling about the left and yelling about liberals wanting a safe space and wanting to be away from anything that's triggered. Like, they give somebody an award and these people go apoplectic. And they start whining and criticizing it and start yelling about it, that they're a disgrace to the nation and that they have all these problems and, oh my God, this is really terrible. This is how far we've fallen. They're going to eliminate the sports. Like, when do we start using their own language against them and start calling them a bunch of triggered snowflakes who apparently want sports to be this safe space that they're so mad about an award being given out? The ACLU of Southern California also announced Kaepernick as the recipient of the Eason Monroe Courageous Advocate Award, and the nation also gave the Puffin Award to Colin Kaepernick for his efforts this past year in being involved. He also spoke at Rikers Island recently with the prisoners, and Elias Husamuddin, the president of the Correction Officers Benevolent Association, it always amuses me that they call themselves benevolent to other police officers, said, quote, this will only encourage inmates to continue to attack corrections officers at a time when we need more protection. Once again, corrections officers find themselves caught in Mayor de Blasio's political con game. This is yet another brazen display of the hypocrisy of this mayor who pretends to support us in public, yet does everything possible to jeopardize our security in private. What he was mad about was the pig socks. The Colin Kaepernick wearing the police officers as pigs socks. And when you're prioritizing your precious little fifis about socks over actual people dying, that says a whole hell of a lot about your priorities. It says a whole hell of a lot about your priorities when you're mad about somebody's socks than you are about the human rights abuses at Rikers Island. And you can go into the records of Democracy Now! Where they've had interviews with people who have been in Rikers Island, the Khalif Browder story of the young man who was there for a number of years without being convicted of a crime at all, being held there, and the campaign to close Rikers Island over the systemic human rights abuses and prisoner rights abuses that are happening there. But you're more concerned about the socks that somebody wore. That says a whole hell of a lot about the priorities of the Corrections Officers Benevolent Association, doesn't it? Meanwhile, the Baltimore Ravens president weighed in about the protests and said that the numbers of people in the stadium were probably lower because of the fans, saying, quote, "Others bluntly told us to keep statements and protests out of the game. There are some of you who have stayed away from our games. We've had significant numbers of no-shows in the past when our play on the field has not met the high standard we and you have set for the Ravens, but this year has been different. The numbers are higher, and it is noticeable. But surely the one-time protest in London has been a factor. Dude, they protested once. Once. It's more likely that there's more no-shows because your quarterback is Joe Flacco. You're 29th in the league in passing. You're 26th in the league in yards per game. Your offense is really boring to watch. And you may or may not make the playoffs as a wild card team, depending on how you do in Week 17 and how other teams do in Week 17 due to tiebreakers. That's more likely the reason, but why not blame it on protests when you can? And it says something that he's more concerned about people's feelings than he actually is about the reasons behind the actual protest. Speaking of concerned snowflakes, State Representative Milo Smith of Indiana has put forward a piece of legislation that would require the Indianapolis Colts to give refunds to any fans who felt disrespected if the players take a knee, saying, quote, "To me, when they take a knee during the national anthem, it's not respecting the national anthem or our country. Our government isn't perfect, but it's still the best country in the world, and I think we need to be more respectful of it," close quote. Well, of course, it's not respecting our national anthem or our country. You know what's also not respecting our national anthem or our country? When state legislatures or federal legislators decide that they can start to use their political offices to limit the free speech of people. And that's an actual First Amendment violation, not some company decided to, ban my account. That's not a free speech violation. When the government is actively working to chill free speech, like in this instance, that is a constitutional violation. There's the obvious attempt here to silence and chill political speech from a government office. And it's not totally surprising, since we've seen that from President Trump. We've seen that from the repressive response by the state to political speech that they dislike or they see as threatening. Well, we see that in Kennesaw State knee college cheerleaders who decided to take a knee, and the response from sheriffs and state legislators there. And when these kind of bills are being put out, or when Donald Trump is making these kinds of statements, it always makes me wonder where the alt-right or the far-right is when they're always yelling about, "It's my free speech, it's about my free speech, it's my free speech, my free speech." When do we get to start applying the hypocrisy to this? That it's not about free speech, that it's not about those in those alt-right instances or their conservative instances. Because if it was, then they'd be speaking out about stuff like this. But instead, they're ignoring it, and they're perfectly okay to let this happen. That they want their free speech so they can be racist and Nazis and, white supremacist in public without any kind of impunity. But any kind of resistance to that, well, then they really don't care all that much about free speech. And when do we start requiring that the phraseology like triggered or precious snowflakes who want their safe space start being applied to the people that put out these kinds of bills? And Milo Smith knows that this bill is not going to go anywhere. He knows that this bill is not going to go anywhere. And he put this out there to try to rally this very, very vociferous white supremacist base that is mad that players of color are making them think about something that they don't want to think about. Jerry Richardson, the owner of the Carolina Panthers, will sell the team at the end of the season after a huge investigative report made allegations of workplace harassment. Allegedly, on Jeans Day, he had women turn around and start telling them, quote, "Show me how you wiggle to get those jeans up." I'm sorry, I can't get through that whole statement without just vomiting in my mouth a little bit. He also apparently had allegedly asked female employees if he could shave their legs, and was allegedly using racial slurs to African-American scouts. Richardson, it should also be noted, was the CEO of Flagstar, the company that owned Denny's in the 90s, when it had its own issues of racism with black customers, like making them prepay, not serving black customers at certain Denny's, and making black customers pay in advance of their meal. That the allegations in this are just frightening. They're out there on full display to read, and Jerry Richardson doing this, like we've seen his kind of anathema to labor and his problems with labor, so this isn't terribly surprising. We also have the NFL Network suspending Ike Taylor, Heath Evans, Marshall Faulk, and ESPN suspending Eric Davis and Donovan McNabb over allegations that were put forward in a lawsuit by a former employee of the NFL Network alleging wrongful termination, and the details in that are atrocious, disgusting, and incredibly, incredibly disturbing. The Seattle Seahawks were fined $100,000 for not following the protocols related to the concussion spectrum injuries, and the staff will have to have remedial training coming after sending Russell Wilson back into a game before an evaluation. And after that issue and a December 10th incident with Texans quarterback Tom Savage twitching on the ground but not being taken out, they announced new protocols and said that the Texans aren't being punished because the protocols were imperfect and that nobody deserves punishment because the protocols were imperfect. They will now add an extra neurological consultant to the NFL Command Center to help with the oversight. That seizures from impact will now be requirements of being taken out of the game, just like being removed for a loss of consciousness where you can't return. If the referee removes a player for head trauma, they must tell the medical staff, and any player who exhibits gross motor instability or significant loss of balance must be taken to the locker room for an evaluation, and everybody must be reevaluated within 24 hours. This is largely trying to seem responsive. It's trying to seem responsive but not be substantively responsive. It's trying to seem like they're handling something, seem like they're doing something, but not substantively dealing with the major problem, which are subconcussive blows. The blows that come from hit after hit after hit after hit after hit. They're not the big seizure-inducing hits. They're not the big bops. They're not the loss of consciousness hits. They're not the helmet-to-helmet hits. It's just the continuous smashing into each other at a high rate of speed. They're trying to make a safer cigarette and trying to put that out there as, we're making safer cigarettes now with filters, now lights, and trying to make safer cigarettes seem like it's going to be some kind of thing that's going to be helpful. And it's not. We need to recognize it for what it is, a cigarette, and it really makes you wonder how much longer we can have the sport of football in the country given the actual issues that we know it has. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, a left sports media. We've just been discussing Colin Kaepernick receiving some awards, the latest on the NFL's handling of concussions, and the divisions growing between the players and handling protests against police killings and for police accountability. Coming up on the show, we'll be celebrating a win for cheerleaders at Kennesaw State University and reflecting on some basketball stars' views of systemic racism and inequality. And so we are going to jump into This Week in the NBA. In NBA news, Kevin Durant was asked about Colin Kaepernick and said, quote, "He brought something out of people that they'd been hiding for a long, long time that needed to be revealed. I'd rather you tell me that you don't like me for my skin than hide that stuff." So he kind of touched a nerve, and the outrage from it made me a fan of him just because he decided to take all that on, but also tell a message of, yo, man, just treat us fair, treat us equal, we're people too, we're not less than you because we don't look like you. A black man makes one mistake, I see how far we get pushed down. For me, I kind of grew up in this basketball world, whereas my talent kind of overrides what I look like. I didn't have it as rough when it comes to that, as far as social or systemic oppression or any social issues. They didn't really apply to me because I could put a ball in a basket. Just me saying that kind of woke me up in a way like, damn, that's all I'm good for? Like, if I wasn't a basketball player, what kind of man would they look at me as? You know what I'm saying? Close quote. And that's absolutely right. And it's powerful to see Kevin Durant have that kind of shift in his ideology. It's the same kind of shift in ideology that a number of players had. It's a shift in ideology that Malcolm X talked about. When you have a professor who's black or you have a superstar who's black, what they're called is, as Malcolm X put it, using the racial slur, that class insulates you only so much from the actual institutional ideas of systemic oppression and systemic racism. That class can only fix this so much. You can go back and look at what happened to former Cleveland first baseman Vic Power when he was getting pulled over in the nice part of Cleveland in driving a very fancy car because he was a person of color driving a very fancy car in the nice part of Cleveland. And when the officers would pull him over, they'd walk up to the car and then realize it was Vic Power and then, oh, sorry, big fan, Mr. Power, big fan. And walk away and not really address the issue. And that's the problem here. Class does insulate to a small extent, but it doesn't necessarily stop racism from happening to them. You can go back months ago when we had Gus Wood on the show and we were talking about the spray painting of racial slurs at one of LeBron's homes. And that class is an insulator of being on the brunt end of racial or systemic oppression, but it certainly happens. And that statement of, if I wasn't a basketball player, what kind of man would they look at me as? That's a powerful statement for a man who has many, many millions of dollars like Kevin Durant to come out and say, and to recognize that his class has insulated him, his financial gains have insulated him a little bit from the brunt of experience of systemic oppression. But the cheering that happens on the court for him or inside the lines of a stadium for other players, they still face repression, they still face racism outside of those venues. They still face the repressive arm of the state. They still face the repressive arm of institutional racism, of institutional sexism, of institutional misogyny. They still face the brunt of those walking out. Class is certainly an insulator of those to some extent, but they still do face those things. And it's really powerful to see Durant start to have that realization, start to recognize that kind of insulation that he's had to the issue, and that there but goes for his basketball talent. He could have been on the business end and receiving a lot of this. And even players who do have a lot of talent are receiving racist backlash, including Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. The former Lakers star and basketball icon said that after he wrote a critical op-ed of Donald Trump, and he's now going to be writing for The Guardian, a left newspaper in England, he says that Trump sent him a letter that said, quote, "Kareem, now I know why the press always treated you so badly. They couldn't stand you. The fact is, you don't have a clue about life and what needs to be done to make America great again," close quote. And that was allegedly a letter sent from Donald Trump to Kareem in 2015 after a critical op-ed. And Kareem noted, quote, "Trump's not going to change. He knows he is where he is because of his appeal to racism and xenophobia. The people that want to divide the country are in his camp. They want to go back to the 18th century. Trump wants to move us back to 1952, but he's not Eisenhower, who is the type of Republican that cared about the whole nation. Even George Bush Sr. and George W. Bush's idea of fellow citizens did not exclude people of color." And that's a frightening statement, but one that we're going to have to reckon with the realities of it as we move into 2018. It's certainly a frightening statement, but it's one we're going to have to reckon with as we continue to move into 2018 with the current administration at the helm and what it's wanting to do politically. In unpaid college sports news, we do have a big success. At Kennesaw State, the president of the university, Sam Olens, is resigning as of February 2018. This comes after his horrific handling of the decision related to 5 cheerleaders taking a knee during the national anthem. He moved the cheerleaders to the concourse in the name of quote-unquote fan experience and said that it had nothing to do with the anthem. In actuality, based on public records requests, shows that it totally did have everything to do with their protest and their demonstration. The 5 cheerleaders will be back in front of fans and put not far away from the crowd. And Olin said, quote, "While I believe there are more effective ways to initiate an exchange of ideas on issues of national concern, the right to exercise one's freedom of speech under the First Amendment must be protected." Well, his change of heart came after open records requests showed that Cobb County Sheriff Neil Warren, State Representative Earl Earhart, and he worked together and tried to stop the cheerleaders. Sheriff Warren said that President Owens, quote, "assured me that the cheerleaders will not be on the field from now on. Thanks for always standing up to these liberals that hate the USA," close quote. And the statements came about, the public pressure came about from WXIA TV in getting access to these public documents and really pushing this out there and pushing the horrendous statements that were being made. And the Kennesaw State cheerleaders continued to take a knee despite being put on the concourse, despite the pressure being put on them. And they've been vindicated here. They have been vindicated. They have been shown to actually be just. Their decision was absolutely correct. And now the president of the university, based on his horrific handling of this case, and the public records request, which have absolutely shown a really horrendously embarrassing set of actions by him. And you can go back to past broadcasts and listen to the exact quotes of these. Sam Owens, the president of Kennesaw State University, is resigning in February, which is a big win for the cheerleaders. It's a big win for free speech, and it's a big win for the First Amendment. And it's a big win for the Take a Knee protests. Meanwhile, at Baylor University, Kristen Tucker is resigning as the Title IX coordinator there as of January 2nd. This is the third Title IX coordinator in a little bit over a year to leave Baylor University. Patty Crawford was the first to leave after allegations where she said that she was not allowed to do her job because she'd been asked to give football players immunity from any possible university consequences or university punishments. Gabrielle Lyons, who was hired, left in January of 2017 because the university allegedly still made it difficult to investigate allegations that were made against students, particularly athletes. And Kristen Tucker is now going to resign as of January 2018. And no reasons have been yet publicly made known as to why she is resigning. Baylor, of course, didn't even put in this Title IX position till a number of years after the Department of Education Dear Colleague letter said it was best practice and what they were expected to do. So the horrific garbage fire at Baylor University continues to somehow find ways to get even worse. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. We've just been discussing the win of the Kennesaw State cheerleaders after the university president decided to step down after his terrible handling of their Take a Knee protests, as well as Kevin Durant's powerful reflection and realization on race in America. Coming up on the show, we will be analyzing the continued failures of FIFA and the International Olympic Committee while closing out the show and 2017 with a much-needed and big positive. So let's go into our last segment of the show and our last segment of 2017, talking other sports news. In hockey news, Nashville Predators' PK Subban has announced a new program called PK's Blue Line Buddies. It provides for a meal, autographs, a meet and greet before and after the game, and home tickets for a kid and a police officer. And when asked about this program, he said, quote, "I'm all for athletes and people in general exercising their rights. I'm making an effort to build a bridge, trying to create positive energy between police officers that leave their houses every day, leave their families every day, and don't know if they're going to come back, and are underprivileged youth. I know that growing up, I had a lot of friends in my community that didn't like law enforcement, and a lot of that has to do with what they've seen. I hope this hopefully helps law enforcement feel they're appreciated. It's a delicate topic, but I think everything with this program is positive," close quote. And it's heartening to see the trying to build community relations with the police and with underprivileged youth. That's something that's heartening to see. But what they end up seeing way too often is the abuses of authority, is the misuse of authority, is the really horrific stances that officers are taking. They see the officers killing unarmed people on videotape and way too often not being punished for it, getting away with it with almost absolute impunity of being able to avoid any kind of consequences. And it's certainly heartening to see them being able to go to a game and start building these bridges. But institutionally, we need to have some major effects. Institutionally, we need to really look into this as at an institutional level. that the police and policing in this country is facing a really significant problem. And if we want to say it's only a few bad actors, okay, fine. But what do we say about all the people who remain silent in the face of those bad actors? The people who know what's going on and don't say anything. The people who realize that what's happening there is not okay and choose to keep their mouth shut. What do we say about them then? What do we say about them? What do we say about that? What do we say? Do we call them institutionally at that level ethically the same thing? Well, it's heartening to see PK trying to do some very small scale stuff. At an institutional level, we need to realize the institution of policing to keep a property status quo. That their goal is to protect property. Their goal is not necessarily to protect individuals. Their goal is to protect property. And when we have a very stratified and very fundamentally unjust society, the role of the police there is to keep that unjust social order. That's the role of the police, institutionally speaking. That individual officers may be nice, individual officers may be fine, but institutionally the role that they're being asked to have, the role that they're being asked to play, the role that they're being asked to do is one that perpetuates injustice. And home game tickets and meetings and autographs and a meal might make it on a small change on an individual level, but it's not going to have a very systemic and real change. And that's where change really needs to happen. In soccer news, the FIFA World Cup is coming to Russia. And the pro equality group FAIR has made a guide for LGBT fans that may be attending the 2018 World Cup in Russia, because Russia has a law banning what they call, quote-unquote, homosexual propaganda. Piara Pawar, the executive director of FAIR, said, quote, "The guide will advise gay people to be cautious in any place which is not seen to be welcoming to the LGBT community. The same message is here for black or ethnic minority fans. Do go to the World Cup, but be cautious. If you have gay fans walking down the street holding hands, they will face danger in doing so. That depends on which city they are in and the time of day. The guide will also include some detailed explanations of, for example, the actual situation of the LGBT community in Russia. It is not a crime to be gay, but there is a law against the promotion of homosexuality to minors. Issues relating to the LGBT community are not part of the public discourse. Gay people have a place in Russia which is quite hidden and underground." Alexei Smertin, the Russia Football Union the head of the Russia Football Union, has weighed in and said, quote, "There will definitely be no ban on wearing rainbow symbols in Russia. It's clear you can come here and not be fined for expressing feelings." But Russian officials did talk about the fact that you can't propagandize to minors. Oh, FIFA putting their major events in places where, rights of people are not respected. From Russia to the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, with a new Amnesty International report highlighting that 53% of Nepali workers that they polled, of 414 workers, 53% said that they did not get the salary that they were promised in the job that they came to do, and 88% said they paid fees to agents, which is illegal, and over 50% of them went into debt to pay these agents, which is, again, illegal, but Nepal's government's not really in the position to do much of anything about that. That we have these mass human rights abuses, these mass labor rights abuses that come almost part and parcel with hosting these kinds of major events. And FIFA just sees fit to be taking money and taking money and taking money and not worrying about the actual effects on the ground of what hosting these major mega events does to communities, or what's happening in some of these communities with human rights, with labor rights, with the governments and their forms of repression when deciding whether or not they're going to put a major world event there. From the 2018 World Cup in Russia, which has numbers of human rights abuses and a very repressive government apparatus set up, especially after the Olympics in 2014 there with Sochi, and Qatar's 2022 Olympics with the numerous issues of human rights abuses and labor rights abuses there. And you can go back and listen to our interview with James Montague, where we were talking about Qatar's involvement in international soccer and wanting to be brought into the preeminent stage of world soccer. And his on-the-ground reporting there and talking with people who have worked in Qatar and some of the human rights groups that have been working on this issue. Meanwhile, UEFA has announced that they will be punishing Zenit St. Petersburg with an $11,750 fine and a partial closure of their stadium for an event where fans unfurled the banner that honored war criminal Ratko Mladic. The space for the fans must be closed, and a banner for UEFA's anti-discrimination campaign will be there in its place. Which is certainly heartening, but not really much of a punishment. This is also a team that's gotten mad that they're hiring players that aren't white. And they still get to have their team and be able to function. Meanwhile, the International Olympic Committee is under fire because the Tokyo Games, which are coming in 2020, have now doubled in initial cost. That it is now up to $12 billion to host the Tokyo 2020 Games. And while they're claiming this is a cost reduction from what it originally was going to be, which was more than double the original costs, they're now down to just double the original costs, with the city of Tokyo paying $5.4 billion, organizers paying $5.4 billion, and the Japanese government weighing in at the moment with $1.4 billion. And this is hardly an isolated thing. This is hardly an isolated incident. When we see governments hosting the Olympics, they go over budget, they end up spending a lot more money for this couple of weeks of mass expenditures of funds. They spend way too much money hosting this couple of weeks party. While this money could be used for social services, it could be used for education, it could be used to keep people in their homes, that this is hardly isolated incidents. That this is hardly an isolated problem. And you can listen to our interview that we did with Japanese-based activists in the anti-Olympic group Hongoran no Kai about the myriad issues related to their resisting of the Olympic Games coming in 2020. As we did that interview, and it was one of our most listened to episodes in 2017 of having the discussions with on-the-ground Japanese activists, from educators to the homeless population in this anti-Olympic group, working together to highlight a number of issues that are happening in Tokyo and the very important ideas related to their resistance and what they mention as almost isolated things in their particular cases are generally the same major issues that we've seen in cities that have hosted the games, in city after city after city. Former U.S. gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar was sentenced to 60 years in prison on charges of child pornography by the federal government. He will also face state charges that he has pleaded guilty to for molesting and sexually assaulting athletes in his care. And the podcast Burn It All Down had a very powerful interview with a survivor and a journalist who broke this story and really brought out the allegations. News also came out while we were off that USA Gymnastics paid Michaela Maroney $1.25 million in a confidentiality agreement to avoid her publicly claiming that she was abused by Nassar. She did eventually come forward and say that she was abused by Nassar. It also led to Allie Raceman and Gabby Douglas coming forward as survivors as well. And her publicly coming forward violates the non-disclosure agreement, so we're going to have to see if USA Gymnastics actually wants to try to go and enforce this agreement. And Michigan State, he was a team doctor from Michigan State University as well, continued to allow him to see patients while he was being investigated in 2014 and 2015. They allowed him to continue to see patients and probably and possibly decide that they were going to he could possibly have more abuses there. And that's a problem for him and for Michigan State, that they allowed him to keep seeing people. How did they allow him to keep seeing people? How did they let that happen? And then it gets even more disgusting when USA Gymnastics filed a motion to be dismissed from a civil suit filed by the victims of Nassar, saying it, quote, had no legal duty to protect plaintiffs from Nassar's criminal conduct and, quote, no duty to warn Michigan State University, TriStars, or others about the reported concerns about Nassar, close quote. Disgusting and reprehensible. You had no duty. You had no legal duty, but you certainly had all the ethical duty in the world. You had lots and lots of ethical duty to be speaking out. And the heartening thing is, as we close out 2017, is that people have been speaking out. As we reach further and further into this political nadir of previously unforeseen lows and thinking that something can't get worse, and then seeing a story of, seriously, this got worse, there's people continuing to speak out. There's new forms generating content to speak out. Just to highlight a few, the work of Lindsay Gibbs at Think Progress, Bomani Jones and Jamel Hill at ESPN, the crew at the show Burn It All Down, and so many others. It's heartening to see. It's empowering to see. It's why we need to keep on keeping on. That as we get into what is invariably probably going to be another year of political nadirs and political low points, finding the ability to speak, finding your voice, and being able to speak out. And it's okay if you're nervous about it. It's okay if you're frightened about it. Being able to speak, and even though you might face harsh reaction, even though you're going to face possible repression, still being able to speak. And it's okay even if your voice shakes to speak. It's okay. And it's heartening to see, it's empowering to see more and more people speaking out and saying what needs to be said. We here at Not Another Sports Show all wish that you guys have a safe and joyous start to 2018, and we will catch you in the new year with our interview of Professor Lewis Moore on his book, I Fight for a Living, Boxing and the Battle for Black Manhood. We recently had an opportunity to speak with him, and we will be playing that interview on our inaugural show of 2018. You've been listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, a weekly news hour highlighting the intersections overlapping the world of sports activism and radical politics. We are available for broadcast by Pacifica Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as many already are. If you can't listen live or have missed any of today's show, we are also available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. Audio streams of this podcast and video editions are also available through our site at nasradicalsports.com. To contact the show, it's at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter, Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, the hashtag NAS Radio, or our contact page at nasradicalsports.com. We have been off for most of the month of December, and that's due to some illness that came up, so we do want to apologize for being on the disabled list for the vast majority of a month. That's something that normally is not going to happen. We're going to be back in here regularly and consistently producing high-quality radio and high-quality video for you on the intersections of sports, politics, and radical activism, because thanks to the efforts of a number of athletes being able to use their spaces to speak out, that partly we wait on athletes to use their space to speak out, but it's also on building the political infrastructure that does allow athletes to find the space to speak out. Because if we weren't in the political age that we were in with athletes speaking out the way that they were, we wouldn't necessarily see the Kevin Durant's talking about race and institutional oppression. We wouldn't necessarily see those instances happening in the sports world. That we can wait on athletes, we can wait on other people, but we also have to do our part and build the infrastructure and build the space where athletes can feel safe to speak out, where other people can feel safe to speak out and to push back against injustice. And as we start 2018, that's going to be the important mantra, to continue speaking truth to power and pushing back against the ideas of injustice, racism, and institutional oppression. And we will be back with you next week for our interview with Lewis Moore.